Hello, welcome back to my bookshelf. Please do subscribe if you haven't already. Today we are discussing Apocalyptic Sects and the English Civil War. To some degree, Protestantism began with a sincere effort to improve the church from within. That is true of Erasmus, for example. He had no thought of schism. It may even be true of Luther. But Reformation rapidly became revolution, one whose aftershocks European civilization continues to experience. The Protestant Revolution is intrinsic to modernity. We've seen that it was a top-down affair in 16th century England, prosecuted by Sir Thomas Cromwell for the convenience of Henry VIII and, subsequently, those who benefited materially from the dissolution of the monasteries. The king and these elites instrumentalized so-called evangelical ideas to empower themselves. The movement caught fire, however, and the following generations waxed zealous. They eventually turned on the monarchy. We saw in an earlier video that the word Puritan began as a term of abuse. Puritans called themselves the godly, and yet it is accurate. Burning white-hot with conviction, these Calvinists sought to root out vestiges of traditional religion. As G.K. Chesterton writes, quote, "It was a story of a father and a son dragging down the same image, the younger really from a hatred of idolatry, and the older solely from love of gold," unquote. What started as a religious fracture rapidly became a shattering into smaller and smaller sects. In place of Catholics, Protestants were now struggling against other, ever tinier factions of Protestants. By the 1640s, a period of civil war that ended with the execution of Charles I and the ushering in of a Puritan republic, there were about 24 splinter groups vying for influence. Let's look into a few of the most significant, always keeping in mind that the direct political consequences of religion in this period cannot be overemphasized. The absolute chaos that erupted in the run-up to the English Civil War is the crucible of modern liberalism. The Puritans were the first distinctly Puritan, the Brownists were the first distinctly Puritan shard. They emerged during the reign of Elizabeth I, Henry's daughter by Anne Boleyn. In Shakespeare's Twelfth Night, Sir Andrew Aguecheek laughs them off as sticklers, saying, quote, "I had lief be a Brownist as a politician." The group's founder, Robert Brown, was a graduate of Cambridge University, then a hotbed of Puritan ideas. Brownists were unhappy with the Elizabethan religious settlement, which was designed to balance Catholic and Protestant sensibilities. The Queen required outward conformity from all, meaning regular Church of England attendance. Elizabeth is often quoted as saying that she, quote, "did not wish to make windows into men's souls," unquote. But Brownists were determined to make a spectacle of theirs. When Robert Brown tried to set up a separate church in Norwich in 1581, he was arrested. Some members were hanged. The group's opposition to church hierarchy had put them on a collision course with the government, not least because bishops crown kings. James I summed it up neatly: no bishop, no king. When William Cecil released him from prison, Brown led his flock to the Netherlands. Robert Brown wanted his congregation to resemble the early Christian church, as described in the New Testament, but differences arose as to what that meant exactly. "The last shall be first" was interpreted in the following way. An observer reported, quote, "To the meanest servant they give the power to admonish, to reprove, to rebuke, and to separate from the whole church." Seemingly tired of constant scolding and division, Robert Brown himself eventually separated from the separatists. He returned to the Church of England, but his influence lived on amongst the radicals. This 1641 pamphlet on Puritan iconoclasm labels the figure at right as a Brownist. Crucially, large numbers of them went to settle America. Most of the separatists who had boarded the Mayflower in 1620 were Brownists. In fact, America's Pilgrim Fathers used to be known as the Brownist emigration. 66 days later, they pitched up in the absolute wilderness of what became the state of Massachusetts. Chesterton again, quote, "It is something of a verbal symbol that Puritans founded New England in America, for indeed they tried to found it here," he wrote in a short history of England. It's true that Puritans faced repression at certain times, but their travels also sprang from a desire to make England anew. They were impatient with their country. During the 17th century, they wavered between totally remaking their nation, founding it here, and starting again from scratch in America. Some made the grueling sea voyage across the Atlantic more than once, depending upon their political fortunes in England. Puritan culture was and is characterized by heightened apocalyptic expectations. This is the dominant mode. The end of the world is felt to be just behind the veil. We see it today in, for example, Zionist evangelical Christianity, in rogue offshoots of Mormonism, and in assorted, disturbing millenarian cults such as Heaven's Gate, or more recently the Zion Society. There is a sense of imminent revelation, as in Joel 2:28, quote, "And it shall come to pass after this, I will pour out my spirit upon all flesh. Your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, your old men will dream dreams, and your young men shall see visions." Unquote. The variety of expressions springs from idiosyncratic interpretations of the English Bible, such as the King James Version, which was now widely available. In the 1640s, prophets roamed the length and breadth of Great Britain, taking advantage of wartime social breakdown to preach frantically. And as it was increasingly difficult for the government to regulate publishing, pamphleteers went into overdrive. It was widely believed that wild inversions and mad events signaled the apocalypse. And for this reason, many intentionally sought to upend everyday life. It would herald the kingdom of God. And many others, whether conscious antinomians, rabble, or plain old criminals, simply got caught up in the general mayhem. In his compelling book, The World Turned Upside Down, Radical Ideas During the English Revolution, Marxist historian Christopher Hill details the ranter phenomenon. Ranterism may be summed up as all carnival and no Lent. Traditional culture has a way of releasing and channeling Dionysian forces cyclically through festivals over the year, but traditional culture was in retreat. The Ranters were a motley, disorganized crew, famous for roaring obscenities, drinking hard, going about naked, refusing to work, and generally making mock. They addressed each other as fellow creature and held their women in common. Hill connects the vision of these lower-class libertines to the medieval peasants' dreamland known as Cockaigne, or Lubberland. The land of Cockaigne is the domain of perfect ease. Peasants loll under pastry trees and drink from streams of wine. Rosewater rains from the skies, and the streets are paved with pudding pies. An ancestor of the hobo tune, Big Rock Candy Mountain, the 17th century song Invitation to Lubberland runs, quote, "The captain says in every town, hot roasted pigs will meet ye. They in the streets run up and down, still crying out, 'Come eat me.' Likewise he says at every feast the very fowls and fishes, from the biggest to the least, come tumbling to the dishes. The rivers run with claret wine, the brooks with rich canary, the ponds with other sorts of wine, to make your hearts full merry. Nay, more than this, you may behold, the fountain flows with brandy, the rocks are right refined gold, the hills are sugar candy, unquote. It's a far cry from the Protestant work ethic. Ranters were tamed by the permanent Lent that took hold when Oliver Cromwell cracked down on the English populace in the early 1650s. A number of them fell in with George Fox, one of the period's more compelling prophets. Fox's habit of shouting, "Tremble!" at all and sundry won him and his followers the nickname Quakers. Early Quakers had ranter qualities, but they were more pronomian. Nonetheless, they were constantly getting arrested for public disturbance and sentenced to the stocks and whipping. Quakers seemed to truly infuriate people. Hill demonstrates that these sectarians got under people's skin by challenging the social order in specific ways. For instance, they spurned what is known as hat honor, that is, doffing your hat to social superiors. Quakers kept their hats on even in church or meeting, as they came to call it. Fox, who developed a distinct vocabulary, relabeled churches steeplehouses. Another democratic gesture on the part of Quakers was their insistence on using the familiar thou with every individual they met. I've often wondered why the pronoun thou, the English equivalent of the French tu or the German du, fell out of common use. We can see from Shakespeare and other playwrights it was common in the early 17th century. One used thou, thee, thy, thine with intimates, as in, can I compare thee to a summer's day, thou art more lovely and more temperate, or thou art wise as thou art beautiful, or, and this is key, in order to insult people. An example from the endlessly amusing Shakespeare insult generator kit gives us, quote, "Thou shameless elf-skin plebeian thou," or "Thou abominable toad-spotted strumpet thou," unquote. It's what used to be meant by getting familiar. Getting familiar with strangers is insolence, a deliberate provocation. A Quaker would use it as a way of insinuating equality with each and every person to cross his path. It came across to many as needling. So the reason for the form's disappearance is linked to this Civil War era controversy. The use of thou became politicized, prompting most people to drop it in favor of the formal you. In political terms, we can see that there is nothing new under the sun. Radicals were using grammar games at the advent of modernity as well. It is not for nothing Mencius Moldbug claims that Quakerism evolved into progressivism. Eventually, Quakers abandoned the Trinity and demoted the Bible in favor of the doctrine of the inner light. When Oliver Cromwell died in 1658, his son Richard took over as protector. Since he lacked his father's dominant character and military prowess, commanded authority, England fell into discord. Various radical groups vied for power. England was on the verge of becoming a failed state. In 1659, George Fox presented a remarkable document to Parliament entitled 59 Particulars Laid Down for Regulating Things. In it, Fox recommended that the whole domain conform to Quaker preferences and tripled down on the kind of unpopular Puritan measures that had seen Christmas festivities outlawed. He supported banning all holidays and holy days, all images whatsoever, not just religious icons, but any form of image, plays, games, dances, bells, ballads, and music generally. He particularly wanted to ban all forms of sport and nursed a special grudge against wrestling. Fox stopped short of completely banning taverns, but insisted they be administered by godly men only. In true revolutionary fashion, Fox even sought to rename the days of the week because they honor pagan gods. Saturn's Day, Sunday, Day of the Sun, Monday, day of the moon, Tuesday, the Nordic god Twia's day, Wednesday, Odin's day, Thursday, Thor's day, and Friday, Freya's day. Parliament completely ignored Fox's proposals, which sent him into a deep melancholy. They were already negotiating with Charles II for a Stuart restoration. This came to pass in May 1660. Christopher Hill argues that Parliament's new oligarchy made a deal with their old enemies, the Stuarts, because they couldn't control their radicals. Hill calls Charles II a salaried puppet. One thing was clear: at this stage, Parliament were in the driver's seat. Chesterton notes that whereas the king traditionally summoned Parliament, now it was Parliament which summoned the king, something that Charles I, incidentally, had hinted at when he saw his son Henry for the last time, before being executed in 1649. In the first months of the Restoration, a militant sect called the Fifth Monarchy Men made a last-ditch effort to seize power, and not for the first time. They had attempted to overthrow and outdo Oliver Cromwell in 1657. Their name derived from a prophecy based on the Book of Daniel, that 4 kingdoms, Babylonian, Persian, Greek, and Roman, would precede that of Jesus Christ. The Fifth Monarchists had believed that their role was to clear the throne for the literal King Jesus, who would return in the year 1666. He would then reign with his saints for 1,000 years. 50 heavily armed members of the group, under the leadership of Thomas Venner, attempted to take London on January 6, 1661. Most of them were arrested, then promptly hanged, drawn and quartered, pour décourager les autres. In our era, Quakers are associated with pacifism. In fact, it was these events that prompted Quakers to define themselves as pacifists for the first time, as a way of distinguishing themselves from the mutinous Fifth Monarchy Men. George Fox and various followers had been arrested in the wake of the Fifth Monarchy uprising, along with other dissenting groups, the authorities having no clear idea of who was whom. Whatever political ambitions Quakers had nursed previously, they now declared that they would never take up arms, whether against the government or on behalf of the nation. So in its initial form, then, the group's pacifism sprang from self-protection. This strategy worked. Quakers lived on, and the Fifth Monarchy Men perished. George Fox took Quakerism to the American colonies. His successor, William Penn, received a land grant from Charles II in 1681. This became the Pennsylvania colony, a refuge for the group. The Quaker brand, so to say, remains strong in America. Brownists, Ranters, Quakers, and Fifth Monarchy Men. So far we have sampled but a few influential 17th century sects. In future we'll tour this territory further. These revolutionaries adapted the apocalyptic mode to their ends. Their millenarian prophets announced the kingdom of God, but what they actually inaugurated was modern politics. The English Civil War and Commonwealth led directly to the American Revolution. It also prefigured the French. In the smithereens of a unified culture that prized harmony above all, we detect the emergence of the liberal democratic ethos. The liberal democratic aesthetic of division, multiplicity, protest, rebellion, atomization now seems natural to most. Many have developed an ear for managed cacophony. Meanwhile, modernity's skeptics are left straining to hear, somewhere above the fray, the music of the spheres play on. Thank you for listening. Please do like and subscribe, and I will see you next time.